Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Community and Protective Services Committee. Today we have a number of items before us to consider, including infrastructure standards for the city's recreation facilities. Staff will present these new standards, which incorporate best practices, legislation, accessibility standards, and flexibility for innovation. They also reflect broad consultation with residents, stakeholders, and facility users. We'll also consider the municipal licensing regime for payday loan establishments, conditional on council approval of proposed zoning amendments that would limit clustering of these establishments. The proposed municipal regulations strike a balance between maintaining access for people who have no other options with increased consumer protection and knowledge. Staff will present the revised framework for the community funding program. This year, the city invested $24.2 million in nonprofit agencies to help Ottawa's most vulnerable residents get equitable access to basic services. Based on extensive consultation with the nonprofit sector, the revised funding program will help build sustainability within the sector by offering long-term renewable operational funding. A strong nonprofit sector increases social inclusion, civic participation, community well-being, and public engagement. The program would also offer one-time funding to respond to emerging issues in the community. Finally, we'll receive an update on the council-approved long-term care work plan as well. So moving to the agenda, any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Confirmation of the minutes from August 22nd, 2019. Carried. Communications, there's a response to inquiry funding for emergencies. Received. First report is legislative services. We do have presentations or delegations on reports 2, 3, 4, and 5. So given that, I'll just proceed with the agenda as presented. So on the first item, status update, Community and Protective Services inquiries and motions for the period ending September 10th, 2019. Received. On the second item, we have the Recreation Facilities Infrastructure Standards, and I believe Dan Chenier will be making a presentation on this item. Thank you, Dan. They all have delegations or presentations.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I have with me this morning Paul Landry, who's the acting manager of our recreation planning unit. Paul has taken on Kevin Weary's duties while Kevin recovers from hip surgery, which all went well this week, and he's on the mend, as well as Deanna Schofield, who has been the project manager on this initiative that's gone on over the last 18 months to a year to 18 months. The document that we're talking to you about this morning is a bit of a brick, so it's not our intent to take you through all of the fascinating technical requirements of our facilities, but rather to provide context to why we're doing this. As a way of background, this project and a twin project were part of the last term of council's strategic initiatives, and they've been bumped into this term of council in order to get them completed, and they're in two parts. The first part is really to be able to provide for the first time since amalgamation a common understanding of what a recreation amenity is, because as we came into the new city of Ottawa, defining a rink or a pool or a community center meant very different things in the 11 or so prior municipalities that offered recreation services. And so for the first time, we are really putting together a common understanding based on our research, best practices, the evolution of the industry in terms of technology and customer services and programming demand, and putting it all together in a document that also reflects Ottawa's own experience with the facilities that we manage as part of this. So that is a bit of context of why we are doing this. The intent of these documents is really a building block for what is to come next. And what is to come next is a renewal of our longer-term strategy to, what is the next 10 years and beyond of developing recreation facilities? What are the gaps? What needs to be renewed and replaced? And what is the new construction that's going to be required to meet the city's growth? And so what this document does is identify, going forward, if we are going to need a pool, an arena, a community building, a community center, what is that? Let's describe it in terms of how big it is, what's included in it, and then that allows us to look at the next phase and identify how much it's going to cost, type of land that we're going to need to build it, all of the things that we need as building blocks to identify the longer strategy. Having these detailed designs also provides us a bit of a shortcut in terms of not having to rethink every time what are the technical specifications to build these things. And so our hope is that this will also help us shorten the process. So we are looking beyond to future development. These guidelines, like many others, accessibility, building code, are not intended to indicate that we have to go back and renew all of our facilities to meet these codes. That is, in many cases, not possible. You couldn't add length to a pool in many cases, or certain types of amenities to facilities, increase rink sizes. It is meant to guide renovations as much as possible when we do major renovations, so we will look at trying to achieve as many of these standards as possible, and then of course to guide as a minimum standard new construction. There will be instances where minimum standards don't meet what the community is looking for, and then that becomes a discussion between staff, members of council, and community about how to afford that additional standard, whether it be to add a lane to a pool or to add more dressing rooms to a facility, all of those things, and identify how those priorities match against the available budget and how do we accomplish it. So it isn't intended to stifle the ability to be creative or be innovative, but simply to provide a background to, or a base to start with when we're having discussions about that. This document does complement existing documents. We did a similar exercise for parks that exists as the park manual. We have a sports strategy that looks at some improvements and moving forward with sports facilities. And then we also have accessibility design standards that are now reflected in this document. I can say as well, and before I talk about consultation, I can advise as well that this document took a look at best practices and current trends and some of the things that council has asked us to look at. For example, looking at this through the gender equity lens, we have reflected in this standard, for example, the growing popularity and demand for gender-neutral change rooms in facilities. So you will find that if you look at, for example, our pool standards, we have incorporated in there what is a growing trend that the universal change rooms are twice the size of the gender-specific ones in our pools. A common practice, something that we've already done at some facilities, but it's now part of the minimum standards that we build to. Likewise, we have reflected the fact that many of our facilities, all of our facilities now recycle, and so as in the past we would design for waste disposal, waste management, we now know that we have to make room for both collecting, storing, and processing recycled materials in our facilities. I'll let, you can speak perhaps to the consultation process, since Deanna led our consultation process.
Thank you. So we did a mix of an internal working group that had 72 members from all levels of the organization, so starting with the managers all the way down to the frontline operational staff and programming staff, like lifeguards, for example. That was a gender-balanced working group to try and, again, encourage feedback from as many different voices as we could. We did open houses and small group meetings subsequent to that, and we did a webinar to try and access some of the sport groups, and we had 171 people attend those. We've also received direct feedback from residents and community groups by email or letter or by phone. And online, we used the software that the city is using, which is Engage Ottawa, in both French and English. That's the software from Australia, Bang the Table. And so we had some extended consultations from June. It went live, and it continued until just recently in early September. And along those lines, if you haven't experienced that software, if you click on different documents and sort of navigate around, you're considered an informed person about the project. Whether or not you add anything in a comment, you sort of have understood what's happening, and you either don't have the interest in adding a comment. So you're considered to be informed, and you're considered to be engaged if you've actually added a comment, contributed to someone else's comment. And so this has been a bit of a two-way conversation that we've been able to have. So project staff were able to answer questions. As residents posted them, we always interacted with the comments. Some of the chains were quite interesting. So this is unique. Before, it was typically a one-way survey where you answered, did you like this, yes or no? You had a small amount of space to fill in your feedback. This was much more like a Facebook Live or social media where we could have a conversation. And so we had 686 people who would consider to be informed, so engaged with the site in some way, and 153 people actively engaged, so gave suggestions or I think, good, perfect.
Thank you, Deanna. The next slide just shows some examples. Not everything about this, these new standards is technical. Many of the comments that we got back were more how to make the facilities more user-friendly or more adapted to what people want to see in facilities. The examples you see there of having accessible seatings for both home and away fans in our arenas, separate areas for those things are an example. Some of the appointments to some of the multi-purpose rooms to accommodate different kinds of activities. If you've looked through this document, you will see that there are some things that are based on user experience, things like adjacencies, what things would work best when they are adjacent to other things, which things are best when they could have access to other areas or to the outside of the building. So as much as possible, beyond the updating the technical side of this, we've tried to capture as much user experience as possible and to reflect that in these standards. So the recommendations you have before you is to approve these standards, and then the second is to delegate some authority to make ongoing changes. We know that things like building code, accessibility standards, the rules and regulations and requirements from various sports leagues change in terms of the types of amenities or the sizes of things that need to be before them. So those are the kinds of things that we want to be able to, and even though the report doesn't say it, and I think we will want to include this, is that we would propose that when delegated authority is used to make changes to these standards, that on a regular, perhaps annual basis, I would come back before you and do a report on some of the more significant changes that have happened to the standards since you last approved them, so that there's ongoing information and back to members of council in terms of the changes to that. So we'll leave the presentation there, and we're happy to answer questions.
The name was here, sorry. Marcy Morris. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We do have one delegation that's registered to speak, Marcy Morris from the Ottawa Sports Council. So we'll go to the delegation and then we'll take questions from the... Thank you. You have 5 minutes.
Oh, I don't need that much. Thank you. As suggested, my name's Marcy Morris, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ottawa Sport Council. I've had the opportunity to present to CPSC before, and I really thank you for the opportunity to present today. For those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to representing sport in the City of Ottawa. We were established in 2013 in response to a request for help from community sport organizations, and we represent over 750 community sport organizations in the city. In addition, we've worked very closely with Dan and his team on the development and the implementation of the municipal sports strategy to which he had spoke, which is really a roadmap for the future of sport in the city. I wanted to share some thoughts today with CPSC on the recreation infrastructure standards. First of all, the sport community is absolutely delighted to see the development of these to provide a comprehensive set of design standards for either the development or the redevelopment of a facility. We worked very closely with Deanna and her team to facilitate consultations with the sport community, and the sport community was absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to provide feedback and really felt that they were being listened to, and that message came out loud and clear both during the consultation but afterwards. We received a lot of feedback saying this is great, we've got to keep this going as the project goes forward. The one point on the report that I really want to talk about is about the minimum standards, one of the slides that Dan put up. So, you know, designing something to minimum standards, which is what the report says, the report also says that at times there will be a need and a desire to design to more than minimum standards. And the sport community would really, really encourage City to think about designing to more than the minimum standards. So one of the examples is diving. So we have a couple of incredible diving athletes from Ottawa who've had to leave to go to the TPAS Centre in Toronto to train. It's because we don't have those facilities here. So we're on the brink now of you know, embarking on new facility development, and in order to meet all the needs of all of our residents who are involved in sport, be they recreational people, be they elite athletes, up-and-coming elite athletes, we really encourage the city staff and council to think about more than just the minimum standards. In addition to providing the facilities required for the athletes, it also provides a great opportunity to host sport tourism events, which, as we all know, are a huge economic driver for the city. So that's basically what I wanted to say. I'd like to congratulate Dan and his team. It's a great first step. The sport community is really pumped to be involved in going forward in the different recommendations, and I'd just like to thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming and sharing those sentiments and your thanks. It's always great to hear. Thank you. I believe there's a few questions. Councillor McKenney first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dan and staff. I know that in terms of the community consultation, Deanna was out in parts of the downtown and really worked with the community to get into parts of that community that are often not engaged, but really count on our recreation programming and infrastructure. So thank you to that for that, and I've heard very positive feedback, so I do want to just point that out. I'm happy with the standards. I've been following this closely. As you know, it's as we continue to tackle things in our community like poverty, homelessness, issues with youth. We know how important recreation services are, and that includes where that programming is. So I've been very keen to see this come to fruition. So just a couple of quick questions. I know that you said this wasn't intended to be used to maybe look at renovations, going back, what's built is built, but I just, you know, when we looked at our comprehensive asset management plan last year, or last term, you know, a piece of that talked about asset rationalization, and that's always concerning. It's concerning because it means that, you know, we will offload some of our infrastructure, some of our assets that could include recreation facilities. And in the older parts of the city especially, that's a concern for residents. So I just want to ensure and get that from you, because you didn't mention that this is not in any way intended to be used to rationalize, look at existing assets and be used as a criteria for offloading assets.
Chair, thank you for the opportunity to clarify that, and the councillor is right. This isn't intended to apply a minimum standard to existing facilities and declare them substandard. You know, we've had a bit of experience with this on the park side, where we approved a set of standards for park sizes, and communities have come back and said, our park is substandard according to your standards. This is a look-forward document in terms of what's possible and beneficial as we develop new, and where it can be applied to a renovation or expansion of a facility, it will be applied. But the intent, and staff have no intent of using it to say that facilities are substandard because they were built 50 years ago to a standard that was current. If it's meeting the community need at this time, then that's fine. If we ever have to do a renovation, then obviously as many of these standards will be applied to it as possible, but often that is limited by site constraints, construction constraints, all those other things.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just one last question. As you know, we are embarking on a women and gender equity strategy, and a lot of that will focus on our policies and our programming. And for instance, we know that girls tend to use parks in a different way than boys after a certain age. That's been kind of documented in other areas. So I just want to ensure that what we have here today, in your opinion, is it flexible enough so that when we start to identify ways in which we can change our programming and our policies and how we build parks or build centers and what we include in those centers are meeting that equity standard across gender?
Chair, I believe so. The standards that we've looked at included consultation with people involved, organizations involved in sports for both genders and even blended. In fact, I think Deanna has some numbers in terms of the gender split on our consultation. But very much this does look at facilities that were perhaps built 60, 70 years ago with the intent of serving primarily males, but recognizes that now sports for women or sports for intergender participation have evolved, and so we have not we have been careful not to build in biases or reflections of past, so that arenas are as adapted to sports that have a high female participation, perhaps ringette or figure skating that predominantly has more female participation, as well as the male side. And our intent for the next phase would be exactly the same for the strategy in terms of facilities that are needed, is to look at this through a gender equity lens, so that what we build for the future is also very reflective of that from day one when we start planning.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Fleury?
Merci, Madame la Présidente. And I too would echo the work of the team. I participated in the consultation and saw how knowledgeable the team was initially, and also how they validated some of the concerns. I wanted to go to two key components of the report, and then I have some more strategic elements. We're very prescriptive in terms of the gymnasium. It's in one of the appendix, or in one of the PDFs, and we speak to, for example, gross floor of 580 square meters. Gymnasium should be 29 meters by 20.1 meters. I want to understand, like, that to me doesn't mean a lot unless I go and measure, for example, Carlton Gym or La Cité Gym, or gyms that have reference points. So could we maybe explain what the intent is specifically for gymnasiums who really open the door to so many sports?
I'll start, and then my colleagues can pitch in. In terms of gymnasiums in Ottawa, we know that there is a shortage. We are by no means the main provider. School boards tend to be. We also know that there is very little market for undersized gyms, primarily in elementary schools. Even though they're great places to run around for some sports, by and large, leagues and serious gym users find them inadequate. And so in this case, gymnasium size does matter. Folks are looking for regulation size as much as possible. I can let Diana or Paul speak to what we've selected as the standard. And I think as you go through, and I don't know specifically if gymnasiums has this, but there are, Deanna has written into it examples of model sites that are the right size. And I don't know if there is one specifically for gyms that point people to the gym at Minto or at whatever facility. But Deanna, maybe you can speak to that.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Fleury. In the basketball standard, we tried to go to the associations, so similar to what Marcy was speaking about, was the consultation was to go out to associations and try to see what their best practices were. So if there was a standard around FIBA, so FIBA, the Basketball Association, the best practices quoted around Ridgecraft or Francois Dupuis were the two gymnasiums. And so we used similar measurements from those facilities, because from user feedback, they were the right dimensions or the right style. And so we based it on those. So when we got a piece of feedback from anyone, the working group or from the public, it was sort of filtered through different lenses. So was it something legislative, like AODA, where it had to be in there? And so if you gave us a suggestion that contraindicated the AODA, then we had to reject it. But if it complemented it, then we accepted it. Then we looked at best practices as the next level. And so did FIBA for basketball or FINA for aquatics, did it replicate that kind of standard? And then we looked at best practices. So we went to the people who use and operate these facilities and said, is this the right storage space for the gymnasium that you have? Does it need to be a certain percentage bigger or shaped in a different way? So I don't think it's a perfect document. It is meant to be a starting point to try and level the playing field for what those gymnasiums are across the city.
Madam Chair, I'll meet with staff to get the specifics, because I'm not sure it's useful for the committee yet, but I do have questions specific to the gymnasiums and the pools. My general comment would be that I would keen in on Marcy's point, which is if we are to build, or when we are to renew facilities or build new facilities, that is the opportunity, because that facility becomes part of our portfolio. I'll use the word forever. And from local groups participating to us, the city programming, to event hosting, they have different goals, but if we maximize the spaces to hosting levels, then we know we've captured them all. So sometimes capital cost, the additional capital cost at the beginning could be worthwhile to maximize the use of that facility. For the committee purposes, we've approved the sports strategy last term. This fits into an important component, as Dan highlighted in one of the slides. But Dan, I'm wondering where you at relating to the facility needs assessments, and where are you at relating to the provincial submission for rec renewal for rec facilities?
Chair, in terms of the strategy, the longer-term plan, we're at the beginning stages of the consultations on that. Our intended delivery date is December 2020, so it'll be about another year. That's been extended a bit because we have taken on including parks within the strategy. Initially, it was going to be just facilities, but in working with folks in the planning, it's our belief that to supplement the green space master plan and other similar documents that talk about overall green space, there is a gap in identifying active recreation sites and the need for those going forward. And so we want to tackle that and roll this into it. So that's going to extend it by a bit. But end of next year is when we'll be before you to present that. In terms of the provincial funding, we have gathered information on projects from across the city that have been submitted to us either through councillors' offices, the community, various sources, and we have that. We have had at least one meeting, teleconference with the province to understand their requirements down to, a very granular level type of thing. And we are just now mobilizing. There are really two streams mobilizing. One is the asset management side that Mr. Gontier in Infrastructure Services is looking at, because the province is tying the applications very closely to the city's asset management plan and the priorities therein. And so what we are trying to work out there is, and we have to actually submit the asset management plan to the province to consider that. The new construction projects, we now have a pool of those, and we are working with the city manager's office on developing a process to validate and understand which projects we can put forward, while still talking to the province about the approach that they would like the city to see. The city can submit multiple projects. There is no limit on the number of projects that we can submit. We may be able to submit some projects by type of project rather than by site. For example, repave 20 recreation facility parking lots without specifying a business case for each one of them. So we're in the formative stages of putting together what we will submit, working with city manager, mayor's office, and discussing projects with individual councillors as well.
Just on that, and more for the committee purposes, I personally, as a local councillor, has provided my feedback to you, but as an overall look at facilities and hosting and upgrading, I think when you look at Nepean Sportsplex, which was the golden standard when it was built, in terms of hosting abilities, in terms of standards, that in terms of a pool is the one where, like, to me as a city, we really need to put focus on in terms of upgrading that facility or deciding what will be the future purpose of it. You don't need to answer, but because decisions will come later, but that to me is important to be said from a hosting perspective, that remains the premium location for the city.
We are mindful, Councillor, of the tournament hosting tourism aspect of that, and have looked at that. In terms of Sportsplex and 50-meter pool, we did include in the last round of development charges a second 50-meter pool for the city, so we are now collecting DCs for that, simply realizing that some of the modifications that might be required to the aquatic side of the Sportsplex may be cost prohibitive, if not impossible, and that a fresh start might be the best approach to that side of the aquatic hosting piece of it. So we are mindful of it. We're also looking, as part of this term of council strategic plan that you just received, some investments in sports tourism facilities like the Terry Fox Athletic Complex, which tends to be one of the go-to sites for many events. We are looking at, for this term of council, some significant capital improvements that would address some of the long-standing issues that we've had with hosting large provincial, national events at that site. So a couple of irons in the fire in terms of addressing some of the priorities you're talking about.
Thank you. Councillor Lulov?
And so how does this report interact with the space to play priority in the municipal sports strategy that was approved by this committee in 2017?
Perhaps not directly, Chair. I think it takes into consideration the types of spaces that the public has been requesting to play. It does nothing at this point in terms of providing new space. It may, in due time, as projects move forward, provide better space, because some of the space that we're providing now is inadequate or not up to standard. It sets new standards for those kinds of things. The other part that we're talking about, which is the provincial grant opportunity, may very well provide either new space to play or some renovations that will accommodate better or different types of opportunities for play. So there's links, but they're at this point probably still indirect.
Okay. Do you have a list of facilities that are in need of renewal, and is this going to be done like via the life cycle mechanism? Like, as a councillor with a ward with 2 aging facilities in it, one that's particularly aged, and the other that has an inaccessible front desk. So if you're to pull up to the front desk to register for programs in a wheelchair, it's a terribly condescending experience. I'm just wondering how you're going to go about prioritizing these projects.
Chair, the life cycle side of these things, we work with infrastructure services. Every year, council approves a budget. I believe last year it was 19 million for indoor, for buildings, and another 5 million for parks in order to do renewal of those. Obviously, it never catches up to the work. To the work. We do work with infrastructure services to prioritize, and of course, safety items and critical systems to facilities are always an important component of that. But there is also a fund for accessibility, and I'm probably talking about Bob Macquarie and some of the older facilities in your ward. Happy to look at some of the issues that you're observing there to see how we can perhaps address some of those sooner rather than later. But this will provide, again, the standard that if we're going to completely redo a section of a facility, this would provide the standards to do it to, and it does incorporate some of the accessibility requirements and some of our best practices that we've observed at facilities where what we've done seems to really work.
Great. So once everything is prepared by the end of 2020, as you're estimating, will there be a budget ask for the 2021 budget so that we can fund this, or is it just going to be guidelines for use within existing budgets?
The plan that we will present you, and generally it's a 10-year plan, is what informs the development charges that we collect. So most of this will be growth related in terms of identifying the new suburbs, the new growth in the city, and that's a large piece to inform the DCs. The other things, identifying inadequate facilities, then requires a different look at a different funding stream. So those have tended to be strategic initiatives, opportunities for government grants like the ones that we're currently pursuing, partnerships, those kinds of things. So it'll be a combination of both, with identification of potential funding streams for everything that we present.
So essentially, like, if we wanted to have retrofits funded at the Bob McCory site, we'd have to look for, you know, as we were looking at this, no, I think at FedCo earlier this year, the sites for potential redevelopment for things like affordable housing, we'd have to co-locate affordable housing with it and collect the DCs for that to pay for these retrofits, essentially, is what you're telling me.
Chair, I am aware that is one of the scenarios that's been drawn, that it could become part of something bigger for the site. But there are others of you know, partnerships of different kinds that might bring a different source of funding to it as well. And you know, we're open to exploring all of those as they come along, as well as the government grants thing, because the infrastructure grants seem to come in on fairly regular cycles, and you know, with enough upfront work of identifying what our priority projects are, and even moving them to, if not the design stage, at least the concept stage, validating that it's feasible, that usually puts us in good stead for putting in those applications.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you. Councillor Egley?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just going to follow up a little bit on what Councillor Fleury was saying about the Sportsplex, and some of the answers that he got concern me a little bit. That's the only indoor pool in my area, and also serves Barrhaven as well. So when I hear things like, you know, improbable or possibly impossible to upgrade it, that causes me a great deal of concern. In terms of that whole end of town, again, not just my ward, but parts of Councillor Harder's ward and Councillor Shirelli's ward. That is sort of the swimming hub, if you will, for that part of the city. So I'm wondering if you would take direction, Mr. Chenier, to put together a brief memo of potential options for rehabilitations for the Sportsplex, as well as what potential funding alternatives there are, not just within the city, but at the federal and the provincial levels as well, so we can have a better sense of that, because once we lose that facility for those purposes, we're not getting it back. And, you know, we just celebrated the fact that we're over 1 million people, and we're not going to get any smaller, we're only going to get bigger. So if you could provide that to committee, give us what could be done, what that, and again, how that might be funded through the various levels of government, that would be very appreciated.
Chair, happy to do that. Let me clarify the comments in speaking to the previous inquiry related to high-level competitions in 50-meter pools only. Simply that it's been increasingly difficult to satisfy national, international bodies with the nature of that pool. In terms of a community pool and its use for community and local and all those other things, there is no intent to change any of that. What there is the intent is that longer term, and we just started collecting DCs this year, and it's a $40 million, perhaps more, initiative, is to eventually replace, or not replace, it's to eventually build a second 50-meter pool that will by then meet all of the high-level competition requirements, so that we're more successful in hosting some of those. But in terms of a local use and continued use by local clubs for competition and all those things, and investment in keeping those pools going, that's not at issue. What's at issue is that eventually we need to replace the 50-meter tank with another alternative in the city. We also think with the population growth that Ottawa is if not ready now, is going to be ready to have 2 50-meter pools in the inventory, and that there will be sufficient demand to do that. But happy to provide clarification and intent in terms of maintaining what's there for present use. That's by no means intending to question any of that.
Thank you for that, and I 100% agree with you that we are of the population, we're good to easily have enough business, so to speak, for 2 pools. But what I'd like to see, and I think what Councillor Fleury was saying as well, if possible, you'd like to see 2 two pools that can absorb high-level competition as much as is feasible. And that's why I think we need a bit more information about how that might, and I stress the word might work. Thank you.
Happy to look at that, Councillor.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh?
Thank you very much. And this is always an awkward conversation for me because I have Zippo recreation facilities in my ward. I just have, yeah, I have a beach. It's nice for swimming. But I'd like to volunteer to take that 50-meter pool if you're looking for a spot because we're supposed to be about intensification, and we're getting stage 2 LRT coming right through Bay Ward. And without recreation facilities, we need to look at building new recreation facilities in older areas. This is something that should be part of our official plan. We expect more people to live within the Greenbelt, and yet, you know, the bigger facilities are outside the Greenbelt. So we have to look at that. It's something that my residents have, you know, had to put up with for a long time. You know, it's just gotten forgotten. We'd love to be part of the conversation. I think this is something that's really important going forward. You know, I'm a swimmer myself, so I'm always looking for pools. So I know very well where the pools are. It's something that going forward we have an opportunity here with stage 2 LRT. Has that been looked at? I mean, we have land set aside for affordable housing, and that's an opportunity. We can combine that with recreation centers.
Chair, it wasn't looked at as part of the standards because that wasn't the scope of work for this project. It will be looked at as part of the second phase of this, which is the growth strategy, the go-forward strategy, and happy to collect your thoughts on that and look at different options. But we will be looking at every sector of the city to look at how it's currently served and what the future needs based on. And the LRT, as you quite rightly state, is a game changer in terms of mobility and where people will live and those kinds of things, and will be a factor in terms of the plan that we bring forward to you.
That would be great. It would be great to have recreation facilities you don't have to drive to, that we can just hop off an LRT and use them. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan?
Just a quick question, Mr. Chenier. We have a recreation complex planned for Riverside South. At this point, doesn't include a great big pool. That I'm just wondering, are there minimum population standards that are required in order to determine whether or not a community deserves a pool? We serve a large area as well, so I'm just wondering if there's, you know, after 50,000, you know, then the people have to go to Sawmill Creek or Walter Baker or the Sportsplex. When does a new community deserve a pool? And with these new standards, it would be quite interesting.
Chair, there are old standards that were provincial in nature, I believe, that talked about, you know, one pool to 20,000 or 25,000. I can't remember. One was for arenas, one was for pools. But those were essentially recommended standards. We know that certain sectors of the city are deficient. Some of those are historical, the way some municipalities didn't have any pools, and you know, going into amalgamation, we've had to relook at that. Certainly in your ward, there are two projects that will eventually result in the addition of an aquatic facility. Certainly the longer term one, the large complex, has a pool. The next one, the one that we are on the cusp of starting, was designed as a community center, but with potentially at some point also having an aquatic facility. There are no funds right now to do that, but eventually that could be. So growth and development charges do contemplate an aquatic facility in that end of town. We are also looking with Councillor Deans at Sawmill, and it is at getting on in years, and we are looking at a plan for replacement of that, which will not provide an additional facility, but certainly when something new comes along, we'll have better capacity and better ability to meet the needs in that part of town.
I was listening to our presenter who said that there's a need for a diving pool. So to me, this is an opportunity. We're going to be building a new facility. I don't know if your divers want to come out to the suburbs, but the traffic going the other way is better. But you know, there is an opportunity there. So I would just I would put that forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Deans?
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say I think this report is really good. It's there's obviously more work to be done in terms of the future and how we're going to approach new communities and existing communities and life cycle issues. But the fundamentals in this report I think are really solid. I look at the field house issue, and I actually have the Taj Mahal of field houses in Bushman Park, which was sort of accidental. We didn't want the Taj Mahal, we just wanted a field house, but they hired an architect. Turns out the architect actually didn't sort of consider winter conditions, and it went on and on and on and on, and it cost a fortune. Looks really good, but it was actually embarrassing to me that we spent so much money and so much time on a field house. So I think having standards and a cookie cutter approach to those kinds of facilities makes a lot of sense to me. And even when it comes to pools, having those standards, using a cookie cutter, I don't think we need to have high-priced architects building, you know, different structures in every neighborhood. I had a chance to look at Francois Dupuis in Stevens Ward. And it's beautiful. I would be happy to take that as a model of, right? Yeah, it's gorgeous, and it makes perfect sense, and I don't think that we need to keep reinventing the wheel and constructing different ones. You know, we build lots of tract homes in Ottawa. I think we can build tract pools and tract facilities as well to the extent possible where it makes sense to save money. And so I think this report is solid. I think it's a good approach, and I think we needed that, and I think we can build on that moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no more questions, a big thank you again for all of your work on this. I echo Councillor Dean's comments. It's very welcome, and I look forward to the next steps on this. So on the report, carried? Okay, terrific. So the next item on the agenda, number 3, licensing and regulation of payday loan establishments. I know we do have staff to answer questions, but we also have a delegation. This one here. So Nelson Belcher from Payday. Thank you for joining us, Nelson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is Nelson Belcher, and I'm grateful to be here, so thank you. I am the president and co-founder of a company called Payday. We've been around since 2006. We currently have 30 locations across Canada and 2 here in Ottawa. I'd like to discuss, obviously, the proposed legislation that is being put forth, and hopefully I can highlight some reports that have been done on the topic, and then we could look to other cities and what has been done, and I can hopefully illustrate and shed some light on some of the cities that have done a great job with respect to some of the legislative recommendations, and some of the cities that unfortunately have missed the mark. I personally believe in what I do for a living. I've been doing this for over 25 years. I'm passionate about who our client is, and I'm striving to do the best that we can to help the client through their temporary short-term cash need. And as a business owner, I'm hoping that the decisions made will be factual based, not based off of a narrative that has plagued our industry for many years. As a company, we've made decisions early on to lend responsibly and also to lend to the correct individuals that are employed and can get themselves out of a situation. We've decided early on not to lend to individuals on social assistance, and we've also decided not to lend to individuals on Ontario Disability Support Program. We believe that the responsibility to help those individuals really does fall on the government at a municipal or provincial level or at a federal level. We will be putting forth to the provincial level recommendations to stop businesses in the payday loan industry from lending to those individuals. And we think that the narrative that stipulates that we are predatory and that we are being predatory against the most vulnerable, we believe that, those individuals are seen as the most vulnerable. So if we remove them from the equation, we're left with who our client base is truly, and that is teachers, nurses, police officers. We've helped construction workers. We're talking the everyday average Canadian. And those are the individuals that really can benefit from the product. As you know, when somebody needs a couple $100s in order to avoid the exorbitant NSF fees that are being charged by the bank, they're making a conscious effort to pay the $30 on that $200 to save the $90. And I would, ask any of you, it's a simple math question, wouldn't you do the same if you didn't have another alternative, or if you chose to use us as a primary alternative, because it meant it kept you in charge of your own finances, and we were just another tool in your financial tool belt. Having said that, I don't want to be seen here as just being self-serving, because obviously I'm from within the industry, and it could be seen as a bit of a conflict of interest that I'm saying here, that we should be able to expand. I do know that as a business, we have fought for better regulation. We've worked with government officials to limit the amount that can be lent to a borrower to 50% of their take-home pay. Not the big guys, your money marts, your cash monies, and your cash for use. They never fought for a limitation of 50%. They also never fought for lowering of rates. When you have competition, competition generally brings lower prices for the consumer. We're talking about limiting competition, and we're talking about granting your money marts a monopoly, essentially, with the legislation that is being proposed. Obviously, businesses cluster together, restaurants cluster together. It's a way in which these businesses face each other and compete. The customer wins in those scenarios. So to, introduce a kilometer, radius limitation means the customer now has to travel a longer distance. One of the concerns pertaining to the clustering is the notion that we want the customer to borrow from a variety of competition in that corner, and that's just not true. If we know that a client is borrowing with a competitor, and they are honest with us in telling so that they're borrowing, then we will decline the application. It is not in our interest to lend this person a subsequent payday loan. From a business standpoint, it's foolish for us, as we need to recover the funds, and if that client is borrowing with multiple lenders, essentially it's given away free money, and we want to be responsible. So most often when we do have individuals that come in and indicate to us that they're borrowing with a competitor, we then, unfortunately, we are not able to help them. We find that that's not a long-term solution. And then what we do from an education standpoint is we refer them to a non-for-profit organization.
Your time's elapsed, if you can wrap up.
Okay. I would like to just bring your attention to a report that was recently done by Cardis. They are a nonpartisan think tank and registered charity dedicated to promoting a flourishing society through independent research. They have come up with a report that I would urge all of you, in order to make this fact-based decision, to look, called The Changing Face of Payday Lending in Canada. They talk about Hamilton being the first city that has put forth a lot of these actions, and gave them a failing grade. And they've also said Brampton is doing a very good job. Brantford is doing a very good job. And so I would urge you to look there as well.
Thank you. Any questions for the delegation? Councillor Fleury?
So I've been a strong advocate for the changes that happen provincially to give us the authority. And I want to rectify maybe two things, and I do have a question for you at the end. One, which is that in Ottawa, we find restaurants across the city. So yeah, there might be commercial clusters, but There's restaurants in 23 different wards. I was asking just the chair for a second if she had a Payday lender in Canada, and she said no. So to me, that proves one of the points. The second element relates to I think, a misconception from the industry. I was a proponent of the cap, which would have created an environment where we have 54 today. You allow 55 to come in and you cap that amount. And then as the industry shifts, they can move wherever within the total number. Because of some competitiveness and because things change, we've gone to propose a separation distance, which doesn't stop the growth. So be careful into how you describe that. Now, I want to understand from you, what measures does your organization put in place to ensure that someone that comes in for a loan and respects the rules that are provincially mandated doesn't go across the street and get the matching loan for the same ownership? Because that is the source of the cluster around, the issue is around cluster and concentration.
Okay, thank you for your question. I understand that abusing of this particular product does occur. A small percentage of our client base does unfortunately borrow more than once. Outside of the competitor that is across the street, as you know, they can get access to the funds online. So limiting storefront location doesn't stop the real problem. The real problem is in every facet of every industry, there are clients who abuse the system. So creating laws that pertain to the minority and affecting the majority, I don't see that as corrective action. It is catering to those who choose to lie. Now, from our point of view, when somebody comes in, we're looking at their banking, and we want to make sure that we don't see any previous deposits from previous pay periods or previous debits from previous pay periods from other competitors. And if we see that it's a clear indication, because the other competitors have to take their money out at some point. And when we see those payments being made, it's a clear indication they're borrowing somewhere else, and that's a clear turn down for, in our opinion. The competitors are trying to do the same, but we can't stop fraud from happening. And I'll call it fraud because we're asking the client. If they choose to fraud us, it's unfortunate, but that's not something we're a willing participant in.
What's the average loan at your stores in 2018?
It's under $500. It varies from company to company, so it's approximately $500.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the delegation? Nope, seeing none. Thank you for joining us.
Really, no questions. That's unfortunate. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Any questions for staff on this? Councillor Fleury?
Sorry, Madam, and sorry for committee members. I'm quite invested in this report, and I'm sorry I missed the planning one. But I do think that the planning components of it, and I see our friends from planning here, and thank you for their work. My only planning question that I missed was the question from one of my constituent who has helped us get the provincial changes, and it relates to the establishment of distances from casinos. And his request to include bingo halls in that environment. Maybe Valerie or staff could just provide some context as part of that, and to understand if there has been some considerations since the proposal.
Madam Chair, I would defer to planning staff on that issue.
Madam Chair, I think part of the challenge that we have is Councillor Blais asked for an inquiry following the Planning Committee with respect to whether there was an opportunity to separate payday loans from establishments that served liquor or establishments that had a gaming component to them. The challenge with both liquor and also with gaming is that those are both provincially regulated, liquor by the Liquor Control Board, Liquor Control Act, and also the Liquor Licensing Act. Gambling venues are controlled by the Gaming Control Act. Under the zoning bylaw, a place like a bingo hall would actually be considered an amusement center, and it is a subset of an amusement center. It is not a discrete land use all to itself. The Rideau Carlton Raceway track, that is a major entertainment facility. Again, the gambling portion of it is not in fact actually a land use that we actually define in the zoning bylaw itself. Those are provincially regulated, and the provincial regulations under the Gaming Control Act and the Liquor Control Act actually specify how those sites are to be run and how they are to work through. We are going to be submitting a memo back to Planning Committee in response to Councillor Blais's question that will detail that a little bit further. But with respect to the zoning bylaw as it is right now, we don't see an opportunity for us to discreetly separate any further from any other establishment that would be liquor or gaming. Now, with respect to the recommendations that we've made, because the raceway is a discrete use, it is identified within the zoning bylaw as a particular location, we can say that we think that 500 meters is an appropriate distance. That is, again, to minimize the opportunity for visibility, for impulse decision making, and also to provide a bit of a separation for sensitive users that might occur. So what we will be doing again is we will be coming back to Planning Committee and to the Councillor Blais with respect to his question to answer how we might be able to do separations or how we may not be able to do separations within the powers that are within the zoning bylaw.
Yeah, I want to differentiate myself from that question and really specify, because we don't have 20 million bingo halls. We have one casino, and I believe in Ottawa we're down to 3 or 4 bingo halls. So I don't want to open up the bigger liquor license piece, because that's a very different environment, but could, as part of your debrief on that component, could you have a section specifically for bingo operators? Because to me, those are gambling environments, and I think I like the staff proposal relating to the casino, and I want it just the specificity of the licensing around bingos and how maybe there could be some separation distances there.
Madam Chair, we would have no concerns with adding that component within the scope of the IPD.
Thank you. Now, my questions relating to the licensing components. So, tip my hat off to the group for working together. I really, from where we started to where we end up, I think it's great that we're putting the right types of separation distances, although I'd love to see one more for bingo halls. The licensing component, in my mind, relate to consumer protection and some element of oversight. And I want to better understand a lot of the references in the report, and I did a quick search on consumer protection, so I have all the segments here in front of me, and they often speak to the elements under the Province of Ontario Payday Loans Act 2008. And I want to know fundamentally, what is the issue of us either duplicating or reinforcing the consumer protection components of that?
The licensing regime that is proposed today complements what's already occurring at the provincial level. Generally speaking, we don't like to duplicate what's already done at a provincial level because in some respects that's more effort for the person who's being regulated. They have to answer to 2 levels of government instead of 1. In this case, though, what we're doing is jumping off the provincial licensing regime and adding a few bells and whistles. So, as you said, our licensing regime, first and foremost, will provide oversight and a check and balance for the new zoning rules that are being proposed. They will also require a few key things. So, for example, the proponent, the person that comes forward, will have to provide a criminal record check. We know, for example, that's already done at the province, so this is one area where we are proposing to duplicate because it's important for the chief license inspector to review the criminal record check from a provincial level, from a municipal level. We're also requiring the posting of a poster to have additional information available to payday loan clients. What we're requiring isn't currently required under the provincial licensing regime, so we see that as complementary, not necessarily duplication. Typical other licensing checks and balances, the licensee will have to advise the chief license inspector of any change of information. They will be subject to inspections. They will be subject to requests for further information to substantiate an application or a renewal application. So from our perspective, what we're proposing is first and foremost a very good tool to provide oversight, as you said, for the new zoning and location rules. And secondly, provides some extra consumer protection safeguards that are complementary to what's at the provincial level.
Okay, and I'm 100% behind what you're describing. What is, could this committee reinforce more of the consumer protection by, it's great to have posters and requirements for those posters to be in place at area of purchase or area of exchange, but could we not ensure that every time there's a receipt given, that also the government information for non-for-profits or for bankruptcy or for entraide budgétaire and other groups that do excellent work in financial in financial support that are government regulated and that are government supported be as part of, fait partie du quotidien, que ce soit quelque chose qui soit donné à chaque échange comme ça. Moi je trouve que ça c'est beau d'avoir des affiches, mais je me mets dans la position, puis je sais pas vous, mais la dernière fois que vous êtes allé à une banque, là, vous rentrez dans la banque, vous faites votre affaire, puis vous sortez. C'est pas comme si on regarde les affiches, tout ça. Donc, je me demande si, lorsqu'on reçoit une facture, on peut s'assurer qu'il y a l'information gouvernementale dans nos critères de permis.
Madame la Présidente, nous sommes inquiets de devoir imposer de donner un troisième document. Nous savons que la province impose déjà de donner une copie de l'entente. La province impose aussi de donner un feuillet d'une page concernant des informations pour la protection des consommateurs. Donc, si nous obligions les détenteurs de permis de donner un troisième document, je pense que l'impact serait réduit. Ce que nous préférons faire, c'est d'avoir justement ces informations disponibles sur une affiche. Donc, par exemple, entraide budgétaire sera un des sources d'informations que nous allons mettre sur l'affiche. Le deuxième aspect qui est difficile de réglementer avec un pamphlet, c'est de le réglementer. Donc, si nous mettions dans notre règlement que le détenteur de permis doit donner ce pamphlet chaque fois, ça va être très difficile pour nous, de façon pratique, d'assurer que ce soit fait. Alors, franchement, sur la balance des choses, ça ne vaut pas la peine.
OK. Donc, moi, je vais appuyer les recommandations. Je pense que c'est de bonnes mesures. I think the team's done really great work. I want to thank the province for giving us that authority. I think, you know, as a committee and maybe as a council, we have to think as to what could we ask our provincial and federal counterparts to help residents in our community access loans with lower risk. And, you know, we have to say the real things. The big banks have gotten out of that world, and how do we get them re-engaged in that lending, that short-term lending, at a more reasonable sets of rates? And the other one, as a society, the check cashing industry, which is sub to this payday lending, is also the big issue. Check cashing, when you and I, we receive our pay, it goes directly to our account. We get zero charges for that. Those who have vulnerable employments, who work maybe a week and get the check in hand, if they don't have good banking records, the bank holds on to that amount. So the banks don't become an option for them. They go to these payday lenders who take up to 25% on check cashing. So you make $1,000, you come out of with cash in hand at $750. As a society who we want to help our most vulnerable, we're living the impacts of that in our food bank, in our housing, in all of the resource centers. So I applaud the work that's done. I think we as the elected officials should write to Minister of Finance provincially and federally relating to those two specific elements, check cashing and forcing employers to do direct deposits in bank accounts, which would remove the fees. And then the other one really relating to short-term lending and how do we make that more standardized through the big banks.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Councillor Fleury addressed many of my concerns, and it was that while restricting the distance between the payday loan companies, I think is a great step. It really doesn't address the underlying problem, and that is the restrictions people face on cashing their checks and getting money. If, as Mr. Béchoir indicates, he's not predatory, yeah, that may be so, but the fact of the matter is we've got 54 payday loan companies or businesses in the city, and you wouldn't be in business if you weren't making money. And if the average loan is about $500, I don't see why we, as Councillor Fleury suggested, we can't work with the banks and the province in order to make it easier for people to get the money they require for short-term benefits without losing the majority of it and making it impossible for some people to pay it back. So you're absolutely right. We see the effects in the city of the effects of payday loan companies. So I think we should, as a committee, as a council, press for changes that the banks are making money hand over fist. There's no reason that they can't contribute to the quality of life for many of our residents by making it possible for them to borrow. And I think we should press ahead with that. So I guess that wasn't a question, that was a comment. But thank you.
Thank you. Councillor El Shantiri. Councillor Egley.
Thank you. I guess a process question. I'm trying to find out under what circumstances with the new regime would we shut someone down. So I'll give you the example I'm thinking of. So someone applies for the license, and we ask for criminal reference check for the manager. So a criminal reference check is submitted for Matt, and it's clear, it's clean, we're satisfied with that. 3 or 4 months into the year, Matt leaves, they hire Catherine.
Totally different story.
They hire Catherine, and they don't tell the city that they've made the change. And we subsequently find out that Catherine does have a criminal record, but they haven't told us about it. So if we were to find out about that, what steps do we take, and what's the potential penalty for the operator? And I guess the overall question is, what does it take to shut an operator down?
To answer the first part of the question, there'd be 2 opportunities to verify that there is a valid criminal record check for the particular manager of the establishment. There's an obligation under the licensing bylaw to keep the chief license inspector apprised of any material changes. So that is an obligation on the licensee. The chief license inspector would, in practice, therefore expect that if there is a change or rollover in the manager on site, that a new criminal record check be provided for that new person. At the very least, upon renewal of the license, where the chief license inspector sees that the manager from last year is not the same as the manager from this year, he could then address the issue with the licensee. So that would be the first thing, and there's subject to enforcement action, such as fines. With respect to your second part of the question, Madam Chair, there is no ability under the licensing bylaw to shut down a business for non-compliance. A business license can be revoked, and fines can be imposed. In terms of shutting down a business, that is a separate level of inquiry under the Municipal Act. I would defer to my colleagues in legal if you want to pursue that question.
Well, I think you've answered in a different way. I mean, if we pull their license, then they can't operate. So in the scenario that I gave you, where they've withheld the fact that they've switched management, and the subsequent manager, in fact, Catherine, does have a criminal record. I like saying that. Does have a criminal record. Is that a scenario in which you would pull the license?
I think it would be a case-by-case determination by the chief license inspector, but there would be a spectrum of enforcement activity that he could take at that point.
Okay, we're still not getting, like, under what circumstances do we pull the license? Like, what is the line in the sand?
Revoking a license is at the very end of the enforcement spectrum. open to the chief license inspector. If there are concerns, significant concerns for public health and safety, consumer protection, that would be those types of issues that would require the chief license inspector to investigate and then decide to revoke a license. Those things are appealable to the licensing committee as well. I cannot say for certain that failing to provide an updated record check for a change in manager would be one of those types of things. I can undertake to take this up with the chief license inspector and get back to you.
So just quick follow-up. So would it be safe to say, though, the more financial related Catherine's crimes are, the more likely that it would be at the further end of the spectrum in terms of the response that we would take?
That is a possibility. I can again speak with the chief license inspector and get back to you, but that is a possibility.
I appreciate,
yes.
offline is fine, but I appreciate knowing that.
In his review of criminal record checks, the nature of the crime, of course, is material to his evaluation of the overall criminal record check.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I should put out there that this was a hypothetical example. In no way am I suggesting Councillor McKenney has any sort of a criminal record.
All right. Any further questions on this? I think circling back to a few of the early comments around perhaps some direction to staff on this, maybe I will ask Councillor Fleury to summarize that before we move on.
So out of the report, I think if we are to give a direction to consideration, and I get the committee's support on this, would be to write to the Minister of Finance. We work with the Mayor's office and the City Manager's office to write to the Minister of Finance federally and provincially relating to the need to offer affordable short-term lending options and relating to issues of work check cashing components. So I don't have the exact wording, but it would relate to those measures. I have ideas on how to solve it, but that's not the idea. We want to make sure that we inform our senior levels of government of both issues that affect members of our community. Could that be direction? Is that?
I believe so, yeah. Correct. Okay. Good. No further questions then on the report. So on the report, carried. Thank you very much. Next, we have number 4, the updated community funding framework and next steps. And I believe we have a presentation on this. Oh, yes, and apologies as well. I'll ask Councillor Eglai just to make a few remarks prior, as he was not here at the beginning of the meeting.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity. So I rise on a point of personal privilege. My spouse is a member of the Nepean Rito on Osgood Community Resource Center Board of Directors, an organization that receives funding from the city. While I have no pecuniary or financial interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, I've decided to declare this relationship to provide transparency in the spirit of Section 1 of the Code of Conduct and to fulfill my responsibilities under Section 243 of the Municipal Act in participating in this debate and voting on the matter. In addition, I have filed with the Clerk's Office a copy of the Integrity Commissioner's memorandum on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and member of the committee. We're really pleased to be here this morning to present the Community Funding Framework review, and really to give you an overview of the culmination of a tremendous amount of work that's been done both by our community partners, our staff, and many other city departments that have contributed to what you're going to see today. The community funding is part of a commitment that the city has made to sustain and support the nonprofit sector in serving people with the greatest needs in our community. This funding investment and the capacity building that our staff does in partnership with our community does a key part in sustaining a strong social infrastructure in Ottawa. But it's not the city's portion alone. It is a strong nonprofit social service sector that is crucial and critical for our residents in our community. This framework recognizes the importance that this group plays in sustaining our city and creating thriving communities. These organizations contribute to a large, diversified, resilient economy and provide incredible social benefits to the city. This funding commitment also directly addresses Council's priority moving forward in ensuring we have thriving communities across all communities within the City of Ottawa. But first and foremost, before I have the team and the community partners who are here with us today to demonstrate their collective commitment to the framework moving forward, I'd like to set the stage for the presentation, because we often talk about the social infrastructure just as the community funding component. But there's a large, much larger investment that Council has committed to in terms of our community and provincial and federal levels of government to ensure our most vulnerable are protected in our community. So overall, in the context of what community and social services as a department provides to this sector, we invest over $109 million in 100% municipal funding that directly goes to nonprofit social services agency, of which the community funding envelope of $24.2 million, which is the topic of the discussion this morning, is a portion of that investment. This funding, in many instances, leverages another approximately $140 million from federal and provincial governments, which we flow directly to nonprofit and voluntary sector organizations, including operating grants for our social housing, childcare service providers, and subsidies that we provide to our housing providers. This significant municipal investment not only leverages funding, but also picks up where policies and funding structures of other levels of government have left off or created gaps in our community. Our investment is critical to the social service sector, and as we are one of the funders, few funders now that fund core operations, literally the components the community need to keep the lights on to serve our most vulnerable. This review that you will hear about today is about sustaining and strengthening this investment, and in turn, the sector. It is one piece of our department's alignment to the entire needs of our community and those who are facing barriers or more complex needs to services. So today, we're excited to show the main pillars of that alignment of not only our funding, but our services to that broader social infrastructure. The community funding unit is one unit within community and social services within our partner and stakeholder initiatives, of which Clara is the lead. Clara, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge the incredible work that she has done in aligning and bringing together the community for many difficult discussions where people were really in many aspects having to bring very different perspectives to a common view of what our community needs to move forward. And Claire is here today, as many members of her team and with her community colleagues, to present the community funding review. So I'd like to hand it over to Clara to invite her, introduce her guests, and to provide more information on the framework.
Thanks, Donna, and good morning. So it's my pleasure to be here today to present the new community funding framework model for council approval. I'm not alone today. Colleen Mooney, Executive Director of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Ottawa, is here today. Colleen on the end. And Michel Gervais, Directeur Général, Centre de Services Communautaires Vanier, is also here on my right. I would thank Donna for that acknowledgement of my staff's work. Manuela Popovici is a key member of our team. I have Sarah Tari here today, and of course, Kat Townsend, who's not here today. Without the team, this work cannot go forward on the review, but especially I'd like to take just a moment to acknowledge the community funding team that works tirelessly with community partners to ensure that we are investing in critical human services. So the community funding framework invests in viable nonprofit social services and represents a significant investment to our social infrastructure. The nonprofit sector responds to critical needs, promotes citizen engagement, leverages human and social capital, and improves community well-being. The updated community funding framework before you today achieves the goal of enabling the city to sustain a healthy social infrastructure through a funding program that meets priority needs, focusing on those with the greatest needs, and at the same time offers enough flexibility to prepare us to address emerging needs. So a little bit of background on the funding framework itself. City Council approved the original post-amalgamation community funding framework in 2006. Since then, with funding mandate priorities, allocations, and other processes. Since then, society and social and economic needs obviously have changed, and the portfolio has not changed. So that's one reason for the review. The portfolio has grown in size to $24.2 million in 2019, primarily through inflationary increase and sustainability funding. The framework currently consists of 5 funding streams, the largest of which is the renewable community funding stream at $23.5 million. In December 2007, as part of the 2018 budget process, staff committed to undertake a review of the current community funding framework and bring forward recommendations to Council in 2019. In the last decade, as I mentioned, community needs and priorities have changed, and so has the nonprofit funding landscape. But our community funding priorities, goals, and processes have remained the same. The limited flexibility in the funding mechanism left the city unable to respond to emerging social needs in a timely and meaningful fashion. Over the past years, program outcomes for funded agencies have been tied to 3-year reporting cycle, and this has resulted in the inability to effectively measure annual program outcomes or speak to annual impacts in a consistent and timely manner. Over the past years, many community social service agencies have requested an opportunity to apply for renewable community funding, as this committee is well aware, but right now there is no current mechanism by which to come onto that renewable funding stream. So the goal of our community funding framework review was to find a way to sustain a healthy social infrastructure, focusing on priority needs, but offering enough flexibility to address emerging needs. In particular, we conducted a review of current emerging needs, emerging funding mandate and priorities. We conducted a needs analysis, including gaps analysis. We reviewed existing funding against restated priorities, as that's what we're undertaking at the moment. We created a mechanism for responding to emerging needs as the proposal, and identified a mechanism by which to support agency sustainability, and developing methods for assessing program outcomes in a more timely manner is part of the review objectives. So we broke the review into 3 key phases, and the phase 1 is what we're presenting the culmination of today. The project team performed extensive background research, which included a review of demographic shifts and shifts in community needs, a review of the current funding landscape and current community funding framework, a municipal scan of best practices, and a study of social sustainability and well-being frameworks and strategies. Second, consultations with both funded and non-funded agencies were undertaken through interviews, focus groups, and online survey. A total of 150 agencies and 185 individuals provided feedback. Third, findings from the research and consultations were analyzed into our environmental scan document as document 2 in the report. And fourth, these inputs have been used to shape the community funding framework before you today. This work has been validated with community agencies through an agency meeting where 119 agency representatives participated in June, and importantly through our community funding framework review reference committee consisting of 31 agencies, both funded and not funded through us, and including funders and members of other funding units within the municipality. This ensures active engagement of community partners in the funding review. So 2 of those members are here with me today, as I introduced previously. So I'll ask Colleen Mooney to begin on the next slide.
Great. Well, as Claire said, I'm Colleen Mooney. I'm the Executive Director of the Boys and Girls Club of Ottawa, and I'd like to commend the city for undertaking this research study. It's been a really great experience, and I am here representing the non-funded agencies. So we've had, I think, about 250 stakeholders that have participated in this process, and I think that speaks to the challenges inherent in the charitable and nonprofit sector right now that we have been so engaged. For those of you, just a quick little info about the Boys and Girls Club. If you are unfamiliar, we currently serve about 4,500 children across 7 locations, all in vulnerable at-risk neighborhoods. We are after-school, evening, and weekend provider of services that are absolutely free. And in 2018, we were the after-school childcare provider for 2,700 kids ages 6 to 12. So before you have some of the stakeholder feedback, and I speak on behalf of my colleagues when I say definitely out there, it has become a very challenging environment for those of us that have to fundraise in addition to some money that we get from other government agencies or the city. It is very competitive out there. And one of the things that's happened as well is that there is new money for one-off project funding. There's very little money for core services, and many of us are providing core services that have a proven track record of demonstrated outcomes, and that, I can tell you from experience, is the most challenging piece to raise money for. Increased cost to run services. The cost of living has gone up, as all of you would know who buy food and gas. Many of us provide meals for our clients, so that has become very difficult. And as well, I'd like to address salaries. So while we support the increase in minimum wage, because for us anyway, that has helped many of our families who are living in poverty, it has become very challenging. For us alone at the Boys and Girls Club, we have over 150 part-time staff. So last year in 2018, that was an additional $200,000 in cost to our agency. The needs are much more complex. We are seeing a lot of new Canadians, and when these kids come to our homework clubs, they need a lot more than just a little help with homework. They need ESL, they need, many of them have experienced significant trauma, they need literacy help. We're seeing youth with much more complex mental health issues. We are also seeing, many of us rely on volunteers, and as the baby boomer bulge moves through, it is getting more challenging to engage volunteers, youth. Many of you who have adult children would know it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to get full-time employment, and they are very busy with their other activities, so it's hard to engage them. So the city's role is really critical to maintain that core funding. And I think what has been so great about this process is we are working actively together to establish priorities, to make it clear what the outcomes that we want to see are and what the mandate of this group would be.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Je suis Michel Gervais, directeur général du Centre des services communautaires Vanier et coprésident de la Coalition des centres de santé et de ressources communautaires d'Ottawa. J'ai le plaisir d'œuvrer en tant que membre du comité de référence du cadre stratégique sur le financement communautaire. Je suis ici en tant que représentant des organismes qui reçoivent du financement communautaire de la Ville d'Ottawa. Les résidents nous ont dit que les besoins et les pressions les plus importantes de la communauté d'Ottawa découlent des éléments suivants. L'évolution et les changements dans les tendances démographiques. Vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que notre ville a changé, vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que notre ville a grandi et s'étend. Il y a des territoires qui sont nouvellement développés. On a une population qui est vieillissante. On a un grand nombre de nouveaux arrivants qui nous sont arrivés et des jeunes qui connaissent des besoins, eux aussi, de plus en plus complexes. La pauvreté s'agrandit, la pauvreté s'aggrave aussi. Les gens sont plus pauvres. La croissance de l'isolement social, de l'exclusion et de la discrimination et la perte d'appartenance, c'est des mots et des messages et des observations que nous faisons dans nos services. La croissance des besoins complexes. Jadis, les gens venaient chez nous pour de l'aide avec du transport, de l'aide avec faire arriver une fin de mois. Maintenant, les besoins sont de plus en plus complexes. On rencontre des questions d'insécurité alimentaire, des problèmes de santé mentale, des problèmes de toxicomanie. Des gens qui sont de plus en plus souvent à risque de se retrouver sans abri ou de ne pas avoir accès à un logement qui est salubre. Les défis de maintien du revenu. Et on n'est pas sans savoir que dans les prochaines semaines, il y aura possiblement des changements. Les récipiendaires de POS-PH et de Ontario Travail sont sur le point de connaître des réductions des revenus auxquels ils sont éligibles. Les défis en milieu rural et suburbain, y compris les manques de services, l'accessibilité aux services compte tenu des distances, l'isolement et les obstacles en matière de connectivité. L'offre insuffisante de logements abordables et le faible taux d'inoccupation à Ottawa. Alors, c'est un défi qu'on rencontre de façon journalière dans le réseau des centres de ressources et de santé communautaires et chez nos autres partenaires communautaires. Les conséquences de tous ces éléments sont encore plus disproportionnées sur les groupes sous-représentés. Alors, les Premières Nations, les communautés racialisées et ainsi de suite, les nouveaux arrivants, c'est amplifié cette réalité. Les données indiquent une situation semblable, que depuis 2009 à 2017, le coût pour nourrir une famille de 4 personnes à Ottawa a augmenté de 18,6 %. De nombreux résidents d'Ottawa n'ont pas les moyens d'acheter suffisamment d'aliments nutritifs. Le nombre de personnes qui ont recours aux banques alimentaires a augmenté de 5,6 % entre 2016 et 2017. Au total, 36 % des personnes qui ont recours aux banques alimentaires, ce sont les enfants. Alors, 36 % c'est les bouches d'enfants qu'on nourrit. Le pourcentage des personnes âgées d'Ottawa vivant à un faible revenu, selon la mesure faible de revenu après impôt, est passé de 6,8 % en 2005 à 9,4 % en 2016. Les risques, les enjeux et les défis pour nos résidents se sont multipliés. La capacité de l'infrastructure sociale et les investissements dans les services communautaires ont besoin de s'aligner aux tendances que nous observons. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Merci, Michel et Colleen. So the environmental scan that included all of the input you've just heard and others resulted in several recommendations or considerations for change that has informed the new framework before you. Chiefly among them, that predictable renewable funding for core services and expenses is highly valuable and is unique to the funding landscape. The municipality is one of the only funders that actually funds core services, keeping those lights on. It is critical to the sustainability of the sector. We were asked to clarify our vision, mission, and mandate, and tie those outcomes and vision, tie outcomes to that new vision and mandate, and increase transparency and clarity of funding decisions. Overwhelmingly, stakeholders have told us, though, that funding the greatest needs, addressing the needs of those who are affected by poverty and other socioeconomic inequities the greatest, is the priority, and to do that where those inequities are most pronounced. In addition to the importance of funding, the sector told us that the city is also in a unique position to address the root causes and bring the sector together in planning functions and in other collaborative initiatives so that we can all together try and address the root causes of poverty and marginalization. The new funding framework offers an opportunity and mechanisms for agencies to be considered for renewable funding, which is something that has been requested, and also offers an opportunity to address those inequities across agencies. We're going to be reviewing the funding across agencies to ensure that it's balanced. Increasing investment, further growing needs, and maintaining investments in community hubs is also primary feedback. So before you is our new proposed community funding framework with a clear vision, mission, key principles, a clearer mandate, and 3 very clear and validated funding priorities. This moves us from a function of only monitoring but to one of leading and focusing on capacity building, responsiveness, more transparency, more collaboration, and we believe more accountability. The key principles are unique in that those resulted directly from the forum that we had with community agencies in June, where feedback resulted in key themes that have now translated into our key principles. So the new framework has that clear vision, mission, mandate that explicitly addresses the findings and recommendations to address root causes, focus on deepest need, sustain the sector, and apply an equity and inclusion lens to that work. It retains focus on fiduciary responsibility and oversight and is aligned to the vision and mission. We also are suggesting or proposing a review cycle of funding agreements every 5 years instead of 3 years, reducing the administrative burden, maintaining an annual outcomes reporting mechanism, however, and then a total review cycle of every 10 years to really look at the funding framework in relation to its vision, mission, mandate, priorities, and to align those with community needs and relevant demographic shifts. In terms of the 3 proposed funding priorities, we see them as interrelated. Poverty reduction is probably the most dominant funding priority, and it's certainly what we will be putting the most focus. Community development and social infrastructure are also important, and together they work on providing the mechanisms to sustain a healthy, comprehensive social infrastructure. Services that support the poverty reduction priority would include things like assessment and referral, counseling and crisis management, and skills building. In community development, we would be looking at reducing structural barriers, including discrimination, stigmatization, and abuse, to resident engagement, increase residents' capacity to engage in their neighborhoods and communities, and increase residents' sense of belonging, access to reliable support networks, and opportunities to develop skills safely and safely participate in their communities. Social infrastructure is about bringing the sector together, increasing collaboration and planning, promoting intersectoral approaches to addressing big issues, complex issues, increasing long-term cross-sectoral systems planning, community collaboratives, forums, strategic planning initiatives would be examples. Those 3 priorities as a whole both address the deepest needs and and work to strengthen and sustain the sector, and they will be applied through a more simplified structure of 3 funding streams. The 3 funding streams proposed are a sustainability fund, which would be our long-term renewable fund, a community fund, which is more of a medium-term, 1 to up to 3-year fund, and an emerging and emerging needs fund, which is 1 year maximum, one time, for those urgent emerging needs. Each would be subject to an annual risk assessment and outcomes reporting, except for the emerging and emerging needs fund. And I'll stop there. So the next steps in our funding framework review, and this slide should say phase 2 and 3, our apologies, is to work on a eligibility criteria. So we are going to be continuing on an analysis right now of funded programs against the revised vision, mission, and mandate and funding priorities to identify gaps and overlaps. We're going to be undertaking demographic mapping and developing a decision matrix that will be developed to assist in identifying the areas of greatest needs geographically in a transparent and objective, to then translate to a transparent, objective eligibility criteria, funding formula, and allocations process aligned with the vision, mission, and mandate, funding priorities and funding streams. And we're going to be bringing that proposed funding policy back to committee at the beginning of 2020. That would be in the form of a community funding policy statement. And phase 3 of our work will involve implementation and transition to the new community funding framework, as well as development of a new evaluation outcome measurement framework. No changes to funding levels will occur in 2020, as the current community funding framework will remain in place while the revised funding framework is being implemented. Funding decisions will be made in Q3 2020, with the rest of 2020 to be used as a transition year for agencies affected. Some organizations in receipt of community funding may have their funding impacted, which is why the implementation phase will include a transition period depending on need, and we will continue to work with our community partners, through our reference committee, to ensure that everyone is aware of the potential changes. The final goal is to launch the full and updated community funding framework in January of 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know this has been a tremendous undertaking, and just wanted to share that a number of the conversations that I've had with the various service providers who have been involved or not in this consultation phase have expressed their delight with how the process has gone and the conversations that have been happening. So just to share that with you. We do have one delegation that's joined us on this, so we'll go to the delegation and then we'll circle back to questions of the team. So I believe we have Mary Aveline, Executive Director from Volunteer Ottawa, who'll be joining us. Oh, and Dennis Jackson, my apologies. Thank you for joining us. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We're very pleased to be making comments on the committee funding framework report. For over 60 years, Volunteer Ottawa has been a leader in helping people make a meaningful difference in our city. We provide critical volunteer recruitment and capacity building services to over 400 not-for-profits who operate in Ottawa. These agencies are relying more and more on volunteers to fill the gap between increasing demand for services and stagnant or reduced funding. Access to a reliable, dependable pool of qualified volunteers is key to their capacity to fulfill their mandates. This is highlighted in the report, which indicated that there are over 1 million volunteer hours contributed to the agencies that receive City of Ottawa funding in a given year. And we only see this increasing as funding is reduced and as volunteers have more demands on their time. Volunteer Ottawa plays a critical role in ensuring that the agencies find the volunteers they need and volunteers find the opportunities they're looking for. Last year, over 42,000 appeals were posted on our website, and 10,000 individuals registered in our volunteer pool. In fact, our volunteer pool served as a significant resource for the city when a call was made out to help during the tornadoes and the flooding. The agencies need also to develop the capacity of their staff and their volunteers. Volunteer Ottawa meets this need by providing training programs at a very reasonable cost. Last year, over 1,000 board members and staff participated in the 50 courses that we offer annually to help agencies build their capacity. We don't provide a direct service to individuals, we don't feed children, we don't do after-school programs, but we do support those agencies that do provide those programs. And in fact, unlike the majority of volunteer centers across the country, Volunteer Ottawa does not receive any funding from the city. We welcome the proposed changes to the community funding framework and thank the committee for their consultation process. We were involved in the discussions that took place during the review, and we especially support the recommendations for increased investment in Ottawa's social infrastructure and equitable opportunity for agencies to be considered for renewable funding. Dennis?
Thank you. My name's Dennis Jackson. I'm a volunteer on the board with Volunteer Ottawa. There's many positives in this report, but there's one area of significant concern for us as an agency. And the fact that there's no provision to assist organizations who are currently ineligible for funding, like Volunteer Ottawa, to receive assistance in the 2020 fiscal year. Over the recent past few years, we've had a significant cut in our funding, our core funding from United Way Canada, and most recently without any notice. We've been advised also that there are likely to be further cuts to zero funding very shortly. While we've made progress in diversifying our revenue base through program income, we're reaching a critical point where our ability to continue to provide services will be compromised. 2021 implementation for changes to gain access to city funding may not be soon enough for Volunteer Ottawa. The difference between Volunteer Ottawa continuing to operate in the next 12 to 18 months or not operate is in the range of $30,000 to $50,000. For this reason, we're asking for consideration to be given to setting aside from the current $24.2 million community funding portfolio to assist organizations currently not eligible for renewal funding during the 2020 transition year. This would involve realignment of existing renewable, one-time, emergency, and capital funding. At a minimum, with respect, we ask for two things. Number one, the one-time non-renewable project funding of $100,000 allocated in 2018 and in 2019 be continued into 2020. And number two, that this money be open to umbrella organizations such as Volunteer Ottawa to offset as core costs associated with providing capital building services. Just like to point out as a volunteer, Madam Chair and members of the committee, that every major city comparable to us, and I happen to believe we live in the best city in the country and in the world, every major city, Edmonton, Calgary, Montreal, Vancouver, all receive funding, some type of funding from their municipality to assist with core operations or programs. That concludes our report, Madam Chair, and we would be open to any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. I believe Councillor Eglai has a question.
I understand that one of the services that you provide is facilitating for the school boards the mandatory volunteer programs for the students. Is that a service that you charge the school boards for because it's part of their curriculum program?
We currently do not charge. We currently do not charge for that service. It's part of our volunteer. What individuals and students do is they go to our website and they search for volunteer opportunities. We are exploring a possibility of looking at how to be more proactive in terms of helping those students look for opportunities. We tend to work with the guidance counselors and assist in that way, but no, we don't receive any funding from the school boards for that service either.
Have you, again, because it's mandated, it's part of the core curriculum for the kids, I'm assuming therefore that there's some funding envelope within the school boards. Have you asked the question?
School boards, in terms of working, providing volunteer opportunities for their students, tends to be a role the guidance counselor fulfill, and in many cases a guidance counselor is usually the vice principal because a lot of schools don't have dedicated guidance counselors anymore. So no, we haven't talked to them specifically other than assisting them with their individual students, but in terms of receiving funding from the school board for that service, we'd have to explore whether they have an envelope, which is separate for that, separated out from the general curriculum requirements for high school students.
Yeah.
Councillor, from other not-for-profits that I've worked with, we have approached, the ones that have been with, we have approached looking for funding and support. And the envelopes, I've never found the envelopes, and they've always been very tight. So I wouldn't be optimistic, but it's definitely worth our while to investigate.
Well, I was going to say, as my mom used to say, it never hurts to ask.
That's right. Thank you.
No.
Thank you. Councillor El Shantiri.
Your mother was wise. First of all, Evelyn and Dennis, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for all your help during the tornadoes and the floods with supporting some of the volunteer or directing some of the volunteer to one of the area. Maybe Dennis, you can answer that because I know you have involvement with the United Way. Some of these agency has did a fundraising in effort to help the tornadoes and the floods, and then we hear some of their volunteers and your volunteers are facing with the police record check, which is a costly, is sometimes some volunteers, they have to get 4 and 5 different police record check. Have you asked United Way or other agency if they can help to offset that cost for the volunteers? Because I heard time and time again from the volunteers say, we're not doing it anymore if it's going to be so inconvenience, it's costly, I volunteer in different section, and each time I have to get that police record check. So some agency are picking up the cost, but I don't think an agency like you who doesn't receive funding going to be able to support the thousands of volunteers you have. Can you shed some light on this?
First of all, if I understand you correctly, Councillor, your question is could we approach United Way to see if we could get funding with police checks? So first of all, I have to make it clear that I'm no longer a board member of United Way of Ottawa or United Way Canada, so I would not, I don't think we have asked them specifically. We have made several presentations, and we agree with the concern of the police checks, and we had recommended to the police board to make changes for not-for-profits. However, that was declined by the police board.
Yeah, the issue of police record checks is going to have another impact on the not-for-profit organizations because a number of them are concerned about, one, that would reduce the number of individuals who want to volunteer, and secondly, a number of organizations, and actually we just completed a survey last week and we're analyzing the results of the not-for-profit organizations in Ottawa to try to assess the impact of the decision to charge for volunteers for police record checks. So I should hope to have that data next week, and I can provide it to the committee if it's of interest in that. But we are finding that a number of agencies are choosing to pay the cost for the police record check for their volunteers because they don't want to have that as a deterrent. And that's going to further reduce the amount of money that those agencies have for direct delivery of service. So agencies are trying different ways to deal with this issue. And you're correct that the impact, although it sounds like not a lot of money, $10 now and $20 in January, you're right, many volunteers volunteer at many agencies. So they have to have multiple police record checks. So what we're trying to ensure as an organization and in helping not-for-profits is to ensure that they can have access to the volunteers they need. And we know with the current provincial funding cuts and the competition for dollars that they're going to be relying more and more on volunteers to help them fulfill their mandates. And we don't want to put anything in as a barrier to volunteers giving back to our community. Ottawa is second only to Calgary in the number of volunteer hours that are given to the community. And we want to make sure that we're recognized as a city that supports that activity. So when we commented on the proposed new funding framework, we're quite supportive of the changes which will allow organizations like us who don't currently have access to the funding. But the crucial issue that Dennis mentioned is that in that next year, when the changes aren't going to be implemented for another year, for ourselves and many other organizations, that year may be very difficult to get through, given the current climate of funding cuts and the reduced funding for us, for example, from United Way, which over the last 5 years, we've had a 70% cut in funding from United Way, and that's for core. And I want to stress the issue is core funding. We can all apply for grants for project funding, but they're very limited, they're very restrictive, and they don't recognize the costs associated with running an organization, the core costs.
Well, Esther, I want to thank you both for providing us with many volunteers. We, as the mayor always said, we had 15,000 volunteers during the 2019 flood across the city. So thank you for helping organizing some of those volunteers as well.
Thank you. Councillor Cavanaugh?
Thank you very much, and I want to echo the thanks that have been given by Councillor Alchantieri in terms of the spring flood and Volunteers Ottawa's assistance in getting volunteers to our communities. It was a huge effort in a very short period of time, and we thank you for your role in that. I'm really sorry to hear about the cuts that happened through United Way. I have a question for our staff. Do we give any funding to United Way directly? I'm just curious.
Madam Chair, just to clarify the question, is it that, does the city give United? No, the city does not fund United Way.
Okay, thank you. Because it sounds like the work you're doing, from my perspective, sounds like a very, very useful, so I'm not sure what their reasoning is, and they're a separate organization. Are you affected at all by provincial cuts? I mean, there's been a lot of cuts that have happened provincially. You mentioned about the impact of the volunteer checks. Are there any other provincial cuts that have affected Volunteer Ottawa?
Not directly in terms of funding, but it's directly impacted on our member organizations, who are then having to rely on us more for services to help them get their volunteers. But also, trend we're starting to see indicated we offer 50 courses a year to help organizations build their capacity and address professional development needs. If the provincial funding cuts start affecting those organizations more and more, they won't be able to even afford to have professional development for their employees. And that will indirectly affect us because that's one of our revenue generating streams. And that, so we're seeing the impact is always not just one impact, it sort of cascades. And when it affects our members, it does affect us directly or indirectly.
Have you made any presentations to the provincial government regarding funding? It sounds like you're sort of being the catch-all, you're the net of a lot of programs that might have been funded previously.
Provincial government funding tends to be project or grant funding. So if we had a specific program that we could apply to in terms of servicing a specific community group, then we could look for grants in that respect. We do receive money from Trillium Foundation right now for our diversity and leadership program, where we're trying to encourage not-for-profits to have a more diverse representation in leadership roles. And that's a grant for 3 years, which is great. It allows us to provide a needed program, but it is a grant for 3 years. So when 3 years is up, the grant's gone.
Yeah. How much is that?
It's about $500,000 for 3 years.
Okay. Councillor Egli was talking about the school board. Having been a trustee for 8 years, I know that they're penny pinching all the time.
Absolutely.
But they would need the province to jump in if there was any kind of a funding stream that way. But I don't think it hurts to ask so that they can in turn ask the province, because it sounds like there's a lot of benefit to that. So I hope you'll consider that.
Oh, absolutely. And I worked for school boards for 20 years, so I sort of know how they operate as well. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Deans?
I'm just harkening back to last year's budget. And although we didn't have on-ramp funding for organizations like Volunteer Ottawa, I believe we did do a pool of one-time funding. Was it $500,000?
It was $100,000 as part of the 2019
budget. That wasn't a lot of money. Did Volunteer Ottawa receive any of those funds?
No, we didn't, because the criteria for the funding was very project-specific. And we're an umbrella organization which does capacity building. So it was very difficult to fit into the criteria to even be eligible for funding. So that's why we're asking, one, that the funding be continued for the next year, but also maybe that it open up to address issues like our organization, who services many other organizations, but doesn't nicely fit into the categories of project funding.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's a daunting challenge. I mean, there's so much need in our community, and I think the work that's being done here is really good. Until we get to, I suppose, 2021, I can see that we have a challenge, but I guess we'll have to consider in the budget 2020 how we might address that. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Councillor Meehan?
I'm just wondering, what's the funding gap you're facing right now after being cut by United Way?
The funding gap, so this year was 40,000, and which is one issue. It doesn't seem like a big envelope, but one of the reasons I volunteered for this board, because I'm amazed with the changes in the last 5 years and what we are doing for the community, both in diversity training, both in leadership training, and both in connecting corporations with individuals, and a large number of additional volunteers. Our biggest issue was that it was done at the last minute. We'd already included in our budget, and that's about 12, 13, 14% of our entire budget.
So would your ask be 40,000, or that we change the criteria so umbrella groups like yours would be eligible for funding?
So we have a comment is that we fully support the recommendation of staff and what's before the committee. We think it's an excellent way, and everybody should compete for the same envelope. We are asking that in the transition year that the committee and the council renew the $100,000 envelope and allow us to apply and substantiate what our need is. Because I'm very serious about the concern of the ongoing viability of Volunteer Ottawa. Sorry, I'm very concerned about the overall viability of the continuance of Volunteer Ottawa as it exists, as a volunteer.
But you've applied in the past, but we're not eligible.
We have not applied in the past because
Okay.
we're not eligible.
Okay, but you're going to apply now.
Well, once it opens up in 2021, I assume we'll be eligible then.
Okay, but you're still facing a $40,000 shortfall.
It's the year before any changes are put in place.
Okay.
And it's not just us. I mean, other organizations who currently aren't eligible for funding are probably having similar challenges over the next year. And I won't speak on their behalf, but we support the changes and we support the opening up of the process. We're just sort of making a plea for help us during the transition year.
Okay.
For those organizations who are probably going to have challenges related to both the provincial funding cuts, although they don't affect us directly, and other challenges with the competition for very limited dollars and an increased need for services. The demands on our not-for-profit organizations are only increasing.
Seems the demands on all of us are increasing from every sector. But thank you, I understand. Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions for the delegation? No? Okay, seeing none, thank you, and thanks for the great work you're doing in our city. We'll move to questions of staff. And a question I have stemming from this conversation is around this transition year, so 2020. Moving into budget discussions, are we expecting that there'll be an ask for that, again, $100,000 of unallocated funds?
We would have to defer that to the budget process.
Okay, I look forward to that. I believe Councillor McKenney has a question.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. We met, I guess it's about a month ago now, and went over most of the pieces of it, and I'm quite pleased that as a city we are recognizing that on-ramp funding, project funding is critical for new and emerging needs. And I just want to start by acknowledging, and I always try to, that you as staff do everything that you can with the budget envelope that we give you. So if I feel there's a shortfall, I take responsibility for that, because that's our decision making here. Having said that, I'll obviously be looking for a lot more money in the budget this year going forward for all of our renewable funding. When I go back, and I guess I've been around here a long enough time that I remember the Feltmate motion, and I remember how money was put in and removed, and when I was reading the report yesterday in more detail, it just occurred to me that we removed as a council, 500,000 in 2011 from the annual sustainability funding. So that's been gone now for 8 years. We removed the one-time project funding, which is what we're talking about today, which was another 500,000 in that cut was made by council in 2013. And if you add that up, we're looking at $7 million that could have been out there in our community that isn't today. Not part of the base budget, but this would have continued to be part of the base budget, less, the 500,000 that was put in 2007 and the 325 in 2018. But I think we have to really be careful as a council when we're looking at our budget, when we're trying to find ways of skimming off savings, efficiencies, what that means in the end. So since 2011, 2013, $7 million is not out there in our community. So when we come back at budget time, and certainly in 2020, And, I'll certainly be looking for a significant increase in this funding envelope. And I just want to point out that, the renewable funding, we need on-ramp funding. There's no doubt we have new and emerging needs. But I'm quite uncomfortable that it's the same pie and that we're looking at the same pot of money. And that doesn't mean that we can't look at some of the things that we're funding today. Maybe they don't fit within the criteria. But overall, we keep hearing from groups, and I do as well, who say, well, I'd like on so everybody else can take a little bit less, but I've not met many groups that can take a little bit less and continue to be sustainable, especially given that we haven't kept up with the needs in our community. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to put that out there. I think that it's important to recognize the work that staff does with what we give them. But also to recognize that we have not given you enough and that we have made cuts as a council that have had significant impacts on our community. And when I listen to Colleen, and I just think very quickly, my daughter who's 12, I stuck her in this camp this summer. It was a musical theater camp, and it kind of changed her, right? She came out of that kind of more confident and a happier person, and she's already got tons of privilege, right? So I think about what that would do to a kid who's kind of at that fork in their life. Or, they can go either way, really. And what that little bit of support can do for kids so that years down the road, they're better off, which is a great thing. But we're also not wringing our hands as a community and wondering how we're going to respond to, violence in our community or increase, gun violence and some of the things that we're seeing today. So I think that we really have to look backwards. We have to look forward. We have to really consider what small investments can make in community funding for our entire community, but especially those who are the most vulnerable and the lower income folks in our community. So thank you.
Thank you. And I should note, I'm guilty because I let off with a question, but circling back to what we have in front of us, we're here to discuss and approve the framework, the vision, mission, mandate. So we will have a chance, obviously, through the budget process for further conversations with respect to that. But Councillor Egline, question?
Thank you. So thank you for the work you've all done on this, and I know there's been lots of stakeholder discussion. I was wondering, since we are proposing shifting to a new funding model, a new way of doing things, has there also been discussion at the table around the stakeholders around things like shared efficiencies and combining resources? Maybe 2 or 3 organizations in the same building could share the same IT support, or could bundle their not their hiring, but their supply needs. So we all need paper for the printers. Rather, let's see if we bought it for 3 offices, would it be cheaper than buying it for 3 individual offices? Have those sorts of discussions been had as part of moving towards this new funding model?
Madam Chair, those specific discussions haven't been had yet. They will happen over the next several months. What the framework provides and what it has secured is an agreement amongst the sector to work together with us on more structural change in order to build the kinds of partnerships and collaborations that might create efficiency, might actually address duplication, and might actually offer opportunity for perhaps new ways of doing things. So that will happen over the next several months. The model provides the mechanism to have those conversations.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate that, because I think that may be some of our solution right there. And finally, not a question, more of a comment. I may get my knuckles wrapped, but I think it is important at budget time that we have a discussion around finding a pot of money for transitional or urgent care not urgent care, but urgent needs that arise. So the $100,000, $200,000, something there that people can access, especially during a transitional year. And I know you can't talk about it today. I'm just putting the bug in your ear, but I think it's a discussion we need to have when we do get to budget.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh?
Thank you very much. I appreciate hearing these steps. I want to thank Ms. Mooney for being a part of this. I know she's done great work with the Boys and Girls Club, particularly in Bay Ward up on Des Maurier. I would like to ask her how these changes would affect an organization like Boys and Girls Club, to sort of walk us through what you see as different for your participation. I know we've talked in the past, and instability is a problem in terms of, playing guessing games of if you're going to have the funding next year and continuing programs and hiring people. So can you walk me through how these changes would affect the Boys and Girls Club?
Thank you. Well, we are hoping eventually to be on that on-ramp and get some city funding. Currently, in our $5.4 million budget, we receive less than 8% from all 3 levels of government combined. So that's pretty significant for us. Like every other organization, like Volunteer Ottawa, we're also looking at a significant shortfall this year, and we've had to do some significant cuts to our programs. For example, this last summer, we normally run 4 10-day sessions at our sleepaway camp, Camp Smitty. We had to lower that to 3 one-week, 5-day sessions, and we had to close that clubhouse. So for example, when the clubhouse in your ward was at Camp Smitty, the clubhouse in the city was closed. So we've had to, make some significant changes to our programming. So we're hoping that this will help us just continue serving the kids that we're serving right now. We get asked by counselors all the time, why can't I have a Boys and Girls Club in my ward? We would love to expand. There's some areas we think are high needs areas in the city, but quite frankly, we just don't have the finances.
As long as they don't lure you away from Bay Ward, because we need you there.
We don't plan on leaving.
No, thank you very much. I know that there's other major participants in our community, like Old Forge, that also worry about their funding. That's for seniors community. So I think this is really important to have some stability. One more question, and I'll direct it to Ms. Mooney. Are you affected by provincial cuts at all in terms of some of the pressures that have been put on?
We are, because we actually do receive some funding from the Urban Priorities Grant that flows from the Ministry of Education. That has been cut. We actually get a little bit of funding, $110,000 a year from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport that goes to fund the Ontario After School program. That has always been multi-year funding, 3 years. We were told that it is that there is no more multi-year, that it's been renewed for 1 more year, but we're significantly worried about what is going to happen next year.
Thank you very much.
Terrific. Any further questions? Nope, seeing none. Thank you very much. And on the report, carried? Okay. So next we have item 5, which is the long-term care 2019 update on the consolidated work plan. We don't have a staff presentation per se on this item, but I did want to just say a few words before staff take questions, and we also have 1 delegation as well. There has been a significant municipal investment in the past 2 years to enhance resident care, safety, and quality of life in the city's long-term care homes. Council approved the comprehensive work plan last year. It is based on investigations by the Auditor General, a third-party review, and significant feedback from residents and their families. So far, 69 of the 84 action items are complete. The city has hired additional staff, enhanced training, improved medication and auditing processes, increased volunteer recruitment, replaced essential equipment, and updated technology. I know moving forward, staff are working with corporate security to determine costs to implement one of the outstanding Auditor General's recommendations on installing cameras in medication rooms and government pharmacies to mitigate the risk of drug diversion. Staff are also focusing on dementia care, as approximately 8% of long-term care residents suffer from some form of dementia. The city is looking at innovative models of care, enhancing staff dementia training, updating the design of the units based on best practices, and creating a dementia care strategy. So the city is committed to providing seniors with quality long-term care, and staff, I'm told, expect to fully complete the work plan next year. So with that, I think we'll take the first, or the only delegation. Mary Cathy McCartney has joined us on behalf of the Ottawa Health Coalition. Thank you for joining us, and you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for giving the Ottawa Health Coalition the opportunity to present our views on the recent update on the consolidated work plan regarding long-term care in the 4 municipal homes in Ottawa. The Ottawa Health Coalition is a nonpartisan, community-based coalition of individuals and groups. We advocate for improvements to our universal public healthcare system. You would have received our one-page information sheet with the letter we sent last May outlining concerns regarding long-term care and potential steps that would improve care for residents and sustainability of the municipal homes. We have requested meetings with the mayor, councillors, and local MPPs to discuss the impact of provincial government cuts on an already strained long-term care system, as well as the need to improve staffing levels, support for the provincial time to care legislation, and commitment to improving care in municipal homes as the most successful model for long-term care. To date, we've received a letter from the mayor and have met with councillors Sudds and McKinney. One of the key areas mentioned in our correspondence was the implementation of the Fougere report from last year. We appreciate the city's actions taken to date, especially on improved staffing levels and more stable employment with the elimination of four-hour PSW shifts. The Fougere report recommended the addition of 35 full-time equivalent personal support worker positions with a view to bringing the level of care to the 2016 provincial average for nonprofit homes, which is 3 hours. Has this been achieved, and are there plans to improve upon the provincial average to meet the minimum standard of 4 hours care as proposed in Bill 13, the time to care legislation? Other issues, staff hiring and training, enhanced dementia care training, health and safe workplace plans, quality improvement programs, and the 6th item here is the infrastructure needs and capital funding. It's good to see that additional funds have been allocated for the replacement of essential equipment. We're concerned that some of the buildings are reported to be close to the end of their life cycle and need upgrades and perhaps replacement. Is there a plan to ensure the proper repairs, renovations, and if necessary, replacement of these 4 long-term care homes? How will plans for completion of the work plan in 2020 be affected by the impending provincial government cuts? In a world where private and for-profit healthcare is on the rise, municipally owned and operated long-term care has proven not only to provide a superior level of care, but also community accountability and meaningful democratic control. Because of increased accountability, problems in municipal homes that are brought to light are dealt with, and the community is informed and kept apprised of implementation of recommendations, and public accountability is possible. Currently, many of the private and not-for-profit long-term care providers are lobbying provincial government for less accountability and transparency by requesting the elimination of annual inspections. A funding problem is not solved by cutting corners, especially when the facilities are already plagued with short staffing, increased complex care demands, and violence. We worry that the promised provincial cuts will derail the plans for 2020. With a wait list of around 3,400, Ottawa residents need the reassurance that these homes will be maintained and expanded to meet the growing demand for long-term care. With the obvious need for improved access to long-term care, we're concerned that provincial funding for additional beds and facilities may not materialize. We appreciate the positive response to date and plan to pursue the dialogue to protect and expand municipally owned and operated long-term care, and we look forward to responses to the questions raised here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I know some of the questions you've raised, some have been responded to, some I'm sure we'll pursue in further discussion. So I appreciate you raising them. Is there any questions for the delegation? No? Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it. Moving then to questions to staff. Councillor Fleury.
Merci à toute l'équipe. I think I get an opportunity to speak often with Dean and the team, so and meet with residents and meet with the staff. So I feel privileged to have that openness and open communication on our efforts and on our initiatives. So I won't boggle down on these issues, and I thank staff for being open to the Family Council and offering an opportunity for some reporting or some planning relating to capital spend in the facilities on an annual basis with the families. I wanted to raise, and it's not for staff response, it's mainly a big concern that I have is when I was first elected, I had the same centers, Champlain and Gary J. Armstrong. Those haven't changed. They're amazing. They do great work. But the level of independency of the residents has completely shifted. And I guess what my question could be is, what sort of additional healthcare components have we added to our centers? And what's the Ministry of Health's involvement in that? Because frankly, I'm seeing some, if you will, some slippage from the Ministry of Health relating to their responsibility that falls onto the hands of our providers locally. So Dean, I don't know if you could just highlight to us what's the hospitals are keeping residents in short term, but they're mandating some treatment components which we end up delivering. So I want to better understand what's the Ministry of Health's support in this transfer.
So, Madam Chair, the funding that we receive from the ministry over the past couple of years has been approximately 1.5 to 2%, and it does not cover the operating costs associated with the long-term care homes. So the City of Ottawa's contribution, in 2016 we were at $14.3 million in contributions, and in our budget this year we're at over $20 million, $20.2 million. So the City of Ottawa has accepted and supported the long-term care homes in terms of the funding. I would appreciate the ministry establishing a minimum standard of care for direct care with our residents, and to put the funding behind that to ensure that we are meeting the acuity levels of the residents in our homes.
Okay. Well, it's good to hear from you, and obviously whatever we can do to support you in that endeavor. My personal feeling, which builds onto that, is that residents in long-term care have less and less independency and more reliability on healthcare treatment. Yet the healthcare responsibility is a provincial one. So it feels like we're becoming some form of a hospital, but yet what we're only doing is we're not providing the services to those it's meant in the first place. So the waiting lists continue to grow, the private providers in that care seem to thrive. So we have a big set of issues that are really derived from the hospital/healthcare environment that really need to take up some of the treatment and supports for those individuals. I see the need, don't get me wrong. I just think that we're becoming a healthcare provider And some of the work that our staff do, I recognize there's doctors, I recognize there's professionals that go in front that are funded by the ministry, but I think that we're just simply not equipped for it, or we're asking way too much of our team members. Recent anecdote, and I think it's very important. I invite you, if you ever want to come at mealtime. Come at mealtime in one of our centers and just see the amount of logistics relating to serving of food, of how we have individual family members that need to go in for every meal to support the staff. I mean, and a couple of years ago, we weren't there. And now I'm seeing families burn out. They're reaching out to my office and other offices provincially and saying, look, I'm at every day at the long-term care. They're not critical of staff at all. They're saying that the need for the individual or their family member is much greater than it ever has been. And that's, you know, I'm raising that as a major risk, that the province is not responding to the healthcare components from residents that need from aging residents that need that support, which for us has gotten out of our traditional box, and which continues to see long waiting lists. So I'm not asking for a response, but really, you know, pushing the pressure back up to the province, saying, you have a responsibility for healthcare. Please be aware of the changing reality. And if someone from the ministry wants, I'm sure Dean and I could show some of the realities we're faced with in our centers. So, you know, we're glad, but we're glad to have our centers. The team members do amazing work, but the pressure should really go back to the Ministry of Health to recognize their responsibility. Thank you. Councillor McKenney.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just be brief. I echo much of what my colleague, Councillor Fleury, has said in terms of just the changes in our homes and the level of care that's required today that even 8-10 years ago we weren't seeing. There's a couple of questions just for clarification. The items that have been completed to date, those include all the AG, the third party, which is the Fougere report, but is there somewhere where the Fougere report alone is kind of broken out, where we can see those recommendations and how they've been addressed? Or do I just have to do more homework and go through each one?
So, Madam Chair, the 84-point action plan we put together encompassed the recommendations from Greg's report. We don't have a separate document in terms of a work plan around the recommendations that came forward from Greg.
Okay, so the 84-point recommendations are all from that report?
Yes,
okay.
Sorry, Madam Chair. The 84-point work plan comes from the recommendations from Greg's report, as well as stakeholder engagement sessions, ministry compliance inspections, and the fourth one, and the Auditor General's reviews.
Okay, that's what I thought. And just on the main piece, obviously, that I'm looking at is the dementia care strategy, and we've had these discussions as well, much appreciated. And I understand that what's being put in place today is focusing on the principles of what's called a butterfly approach. But I just wonder, you know, how we're going to take that further step, and how we can take that further step to ensure that you know, what we have is a, you know, a holistic approach, but a very focused approach for our residents who need that whether it's the butterfly approach, whatever it is, to ensure that we're meeting their needs. There's a difference between focusing on the principles of something, which I appreciate. That's a first step. But where do we go from here, and how do we measure that?
So, Madam Chair, we've developed a work group across the 4 homes, and we've been doing research into the different innovative models of dementia care, one of them being the butterfly approach, Montessori dementiability, the greenhouse. So we've been looking at best practices within those principles. We also have one of our administrators has been attending a 3-week workshop, and the shop is being put on by Dementia Care Matters, which are the founders of the butterfly approach. She's leading the dementia care strategy within our homes. She's also representing us on a work group across the region around transforming long-term care. And so we have sector partners that are at that table, as well as families and members of the Family Council. And we're looking at sharing of best practices across the region and identifying how we can be implementing them into our homes. Some of the principles are difficult to implement in our homes because of the physical structure. The butterfly approach really promotes smaller units, and we're restricted with the physical structures that we have today. But that doesn't mean we can't be looking at implementing other best practices into the homes. Some of the things we've done today, we're testing virtual reality headsets for our residents with dementia. We're looking to put indoor flower gardens into one of the homes. We've implemented what's called Montessori nooks. These are interactive areas where residents can touch and feel different things like a nursery, a kitchen, an office, a workshop area. So these are some of the actions that we're putting in place today. We're also decorating our units. So for residents who suffer from dementia, bright colors help them to adapt to the environment. And so we're in the process of working with Recreation, Culture, and Facilities. We've painted 2 of the homes so far, and we have 2 other homes that we want to paint, the dementia care units. Again, supporting those principles of Butterfly and Montessori.
Thank you. Councillor Kavanagh?
Thank you very much. I believe Councillor McKinney asked the questions I was going to ask. It was about the butterfly model. And I really appreciate the fact that you met with both of us to talk about this. This is an issue, as you know, that from my ward, we had a group of women, all widows, who went through dementia struggles with their spouses and banded together to work together at the grassroots level to bring this model to the attention of the city. And I really appreciate the uptake. And I know it's not perfect because it's better in smaller situations, but I want to thank you for taking the principles. I think this is the way to go forward. It's just a more humane way of dealing with dementia, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none. Thank you very much. And on the report received? Terrific. Any notices of motion? Subsequent meetings? None. Inquiries? Other business? Adjournment. Next meeting, October 17th. Thank you very much.